Dr. Elena Vasquez pressed her keycard against the reader for the third time, watching the red light blink stubbornly back at her. She let out a slow breath, glancing over her shoulder at the empty corridor behind her. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night, and Biosyn's genetics research facility in the Sierra Nevada mountains was operating on skeleton crew mode. Most of the staff had already left for the weekend, heading down the mountain to Fresno or back to their families in the Bay Area. Only essential personnel remained, and technically, Elena wasn't supposed to be one of them. She was 34 years old, a senior geneticist who had been with Biosyn for 6 years, working her way up from a junior researcher position to leading her own team studying de-extinction protocols. She had a PhD from Stanford, had published 17 papers in major journals, and had been instrumental in the successful cloning of 3 extinct species in the past 2 years. None of those species were dinosaurs. Of course, Biosyn's public face was all about restoring recently extinct animals, bringing back species like the passenger pigeon and the Tasmanian tiger for conservation purposes. It was noble work, feel-good science that played well in the media and kept the funding flowing. But Elena knew what else was happening in the facility. She had heard the rumors, seen the redacted sections in reports, noticed the restricted access floors that even senior staff couldn't enter without special clearance. And 3 weeks ago, she had stumbled across something that had changed everything. A file left open on a colleague's computer, just for a moment, but long enough for Elena to see the heading. Project Apex, Theropod Viability Study, Phase 3. Since then, Elena had been carefully, methodically gathering evidence. She had used her access privileges to dig through databases, had stayed late to observe unusual shipments, arriving at the loading docks, had even befriended one of the security guards who had let slip that there were things on sub-level for that would blow your mind. She had compiled documents, taken photographs of shipping manifests, recorded video of locked doors with warning signs that read, "Extreme biohazard, level 5 containment required." And tonight, she was going to get proof of what Biosyn was really doing. Tonight, she was going to infiltrate sub-level 4 and document whatever they were hiding down there. Then she would take that evidence to the press, to regulatory agencies, to anyone who would listen. Because if her suspicions were correct, if Biosyn had actually succeeded in cloning dinosaurs and was keeping them in a facility that was completely unprepared for that kind of containment, then everyone in this building, and potentially everyone in the surrounding area, was in danger. The keycard finally registered green, and the door clicked open. Elena slipped through into the stairwell, her heart already starting to beat faster. She was wearing dark clothes, had her phone in her pocket with the camera ready, and had a small backpack with her laptop, a portable hard drive, and some basic supplies. She also had a canister of pepper spray on her belt, though she wasn't sure what good it would do if she ran into actual security personnel. Her plan was simple: don't get caught. The stairwell was cold and utilitarian, all concrete and metal railings, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. Elena descended quickly, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. She passed the door for sub-level 1, which housed mostly storage and maintenance systems, then sub-level 2, where the majority of the genetics labs were located. That was where Elena normally worked, in Lab 7B, analyzing gene sequences and running viability simulations. Sub-level 3 was where the animal containment areas were, the clean rooms where they kept the successfully cloned specimens. Elena had been down there many times, had worked with the passenger pigeons and the Tasmanian tiger cubs. Those areas were well lit, carefully monitored, designed for small animals that posed no threat. Sub-level 4 was different. Elena had only been to the entrance once, about a year ago, when she had been part of a tour for new senior staff. They had been shown the door, had been told it was advanced containment for future projects, and then had been quickly ushered back upstairs. The door required special biometric clearance, and Elena didn't have it. But what she did have was information. 2 days ago, she had watched from a concealed position as one of the senior project directors. Dr. Raymond Cole had entered sublevel 4. She had used her phone to record him entering his code on the keypad, and with some careful video analysis and a bit of luck, she had been able to make out the numbers. 7-4-8-3-2-9. Now, standing in front of the sublevel 4 door, Elena hesitated. This was it. Once she went through this door, there was no going back. If she was caught, she would lose her job, possibly face criminal charges for corporate espionage or breaking and entering. But if she didn't go through, if she walked away now, and something terrible happened because Biosyn was playing God with creatures they couldn't control, she would never forgive herself. Elena entered the code. The keypad beeped, and for a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then the heavy door clicked and began to swing open with a hydraulic hiss. Elena stepped through quickly, and the door sealed behind her with a solid thunk that made her jump. The corridor beyond was different from the rest of the facility. The lighting was dimmer, more industrial, and the walls were reinforced concrete rather than the painted drywall of the upper levels. The air smelled different too, a mixture of disinfectant and something else. Something organic and slightly unpleasant. Elena pulled out her phone and started recording, narrating in a whisper as she moved forward. This is Dr. Elena Vasquez, November 17th, 11:52 p.m. I'm in the sublevel 4 restricted area of Biosyn's Sierra Nevada facility. I'm documenting what I believe to be an unauthorized and dangerous de-extinction project. The corridor stretched ahead of her, doors on either side marked with numbers and cryptic labels. Elena tried the first door and found it locked. The second opened into what looked like a storage room, shelves lined with equipment and supplies. Nothing unusual there. She continued down the corridor, checking doors, her anxiety growing with each step. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe sublevel 4 was just storage or equipment or something completely mundane, and she was about to ruin her career for nothing. Then she reached a door marked Observation Gallery 4A and found it unlocked. Elena pushed it open and stepped into a small room with a large window taking up most of one wall. The window looked down into an enormous chamber below, and what Elena saw there made her blood run cold. It was a containment area, easily the size of a basketball court, with walls that rose at least 30 feet high. The floor was a mix of concrete and what looked like artificial terrain, complete with rocks, vegetation, and even a small water feature. But it was what occupied the space that made Elena's hands start to shake as she raised her phone to record. There were 3 of them. Dinosaurs. Actual, living, breathing dinosaurs. They were small, relatively speaking, maybe 6 feet tall and 10 feet long, including their tails. They had sleek bodies covered in what looked like a mix of scales and primitive feathers, with coloration that ranged from dark green to brown with striped patterns. Their heads were narrow and predatory, with sharp eyes and mouths full of visible teeth. They moved with an unsettling grace, quick and bird-like, their tails held stiff behind them for balance. Velociraptors, or something very close to them. Elena recognized them from countless papers she had read, from the fossil records and artistic reconstructions. But seeing them alive, moving, hunting, was something else entirely. As she watched, one of them pounced on what looked like a live chicken that had been released into the enclosure, dispatching it with brutal efficiency. Elena's hands were definitely shaking now as she recorded. "Oh my God," she whispered. "They actually did it. They actually cloned raptors. This is insane. This facility is not equipped for this kind of containment. We don't have the protocols. We don't have the security measures. If these things got out..." She was interrupted by a sound from behind her. A door opening. Footsteps. Elena spun around, her heart leaping in her throat, and found herself face to face with Dr. Raymond Cole. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with graying hair and glasses, wearing a lab coat even at this late hour. Behind him stood 2 security guards, both looking alert and far from friendly. Dr. Vasquez, Cole said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel underneath. I had a feeling we might find you down here. You've been asking a lot of questions lately. Accessing files you shouldn't be accessing. Staying late when you should be gone. Elena's mind raced. She was caught. Completely, utterly caught. But her phone was still recording, still in her hand. Dr. Cole, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. What you're doing here is illegal. It's dangerous. These animals, if they escaped... They won't escape, Cole interrupted. We have state-of-the-art containment. Multiple redundancies. These specimens are perfectly controlled. He took a step toward her, and Elena instinctively backed up against the observation window. But you, Dr. Vasquez, you're a problem. You've seen things you weren't supposed to see. You're recording things that could cause serious complications for this company. One of the security guards moved forward, reaching for Elena's phone. She jerked it away, but the guard was faster, grabbing her wrist. Elena struggled, and in the scuffle, her phone went flying, skittering across the floor to land near the door. The guard grabbed Elena's arms, pulling them behind her back, and she felt the cold metal of zip-tie cuffs being fastened around her wrists. You can't do this, Elena said, her voice rising. You can't just lock me up. People know I'm here. They'll come looking for me. Cole smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Actually, according to the security logs, you left the facility at 7:30 this evening. Your key card was scanned at the exit, and your car left the parking lot. Isn't that right, Stevens? He looked at one of the guards, who nodded. That's right, sir. Dr. Vasquez is off-site. Has been for hours. Elena felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. They had planned for this. They had been watching her, had known she would try something, and they had set up a cover story. You're going to kill me, she said quietly. You're going to make me disappear. Don't be dramatic, Cole said, though his expression suggested that Elena wasn't far from the truth. We just need to keep you contained until we can figure out what to do with you. There's a holding area on this level. You'll be comfortable enough. He gestured to the guards. Take her to cell 4C. I'll deal with her in the morning. The guards started to drag Elena toward the door, and she struggled against them, her mind racing. She had to do something, had to fight back, but the guards were strong, and she was effectively helpless with her hands bound. They were almost to the door when it happened. An alarm. Loud, piercing, echoing through the corridor. Red lights began flashing along the ceiling, and an automated voice came over the intercom. Warning, containment breach. Sublevel 4. All personnel evacuate immediately. This is not a drill. Everyone froze. Cole's face went white. What? He said, turning to the guards. What section? Which containment? One of the guards released Elena and pulled out a radio. Control, this is Stevens on Sublevel 4. Requesting status on containment breach. Which unit? The radio crackled. Stevens, we're showing breach in 4A. The observation gallery. Recommend immediate evacuation. Specimens are loose in the corridor. Elena felt her stomach drop. 4A, the gallery she was standing in. She turned to look at the observation window, and her blood turned to ice. One of the raptors was no longer in the containment chamber below. It had found a ventilation grate, had somehow pried it open, and the opening led up into the observation gallery. Elena could see the damaged grate hanging loose, could see claw marks around the opening, and she could hear something moving in the ceiling above them. Get out, Cole said, his voice suddenly urgent. Get out now. The guards didn't need to be told twice. They bolted for the door, and Cole was right behind them. Elena, still bound at the wrists, stumbled after them, her heart hammering. She heard a crash behind her and glanced back to see a ceiling panel fall, and then a sleek, terrifying shape dropped into the observation gallery. The raptor landed with predatory grace, its head swiveling to fix on Elena with eyes that gleamed with intelligence. It was smaller than she had expected up close, but no less terrifying. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing rows of curved teeth, and it made a sound, a sharp hissing chirp that sent chills down Elena's spine. Elena ran. Her hands were still bound, throwing off her balance, but she ran with everything she had. The corridor ahead was chaos, alarms blaring, red lights flashing, and she could hear shouting from somewhere nearby. The guards in Cole had disappeared, had left her behind without a second thought, and now she was alone in a restricted facility with a loose dinosaur. She could hear it behind her, the clicking of claws on concrete, the rapid breathing. It was fast, so fast, and Elena knew she couldn't outrun it for long. She saw a door ahead marked emergency equipment and threw herself at it. The door was unlocked, thank God, and she stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. There was no lock, nothing to secure it, but maybe the raptor wouldn't. The door shuddered as something hit it from the other side. The raptor. It was testing the door, pushing at it. Elena looked around frantically. The room was small, filled with emergency supplies, fire extinguishers, first aid kits, oxygen tanks, emergency lighting equipment. And there, on a hook on the wall, a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. Elena grabbed the bolt cutters awkwardly, maneuvering her bound hands to position the cutters against the zip ties. It was difficult, painful, but she managed to get the jaws of the cutters around the plastic. She squeezed with all her strength, and the zip tie snapped. Her hands were free. The door shuttered again, harder this time. Elena looked at the emergency equipment around her and had an idea. It was risky, possibly insane, but she was out of options. She grabbed one of the fire extinguishers, positioned herself next to the door, and waited. The door burst open, and the raptor lunged through. Elena didn't hesitate. She pulled the pin on the fire extinguisher and sprayed directly into the creature's face. The raptor recoiled, shrieking, shaking its head violently as the chemical foam blinded it. Elena didn't wait to see what it would do next. She bolted past it, back into the corridor. She ran without direction, just trying to get away, to find an exit, to find anyone who could help. The corridors of Sublevel 4 were a maze, and with the alarm blaring and the red lights flashing, everything looked the same. She turned a corner and nearly collided with another person, a young technician in a lab coat who looked just as terrified as Elena felt. "The stairs," the technician shouted over the alarm. "We need to get to the stairs." Elena followed him, and they ran together down the corridor. Behind them, Elena could hear that shrieking sound again, and she knew the raptor had recovered from the fire extinguisher. They reached a junction, and the technician pointed to the right. "That way. The emergency stairs are that way." They turned right and found themselves in a wider corridor. The emergency stairs were visible at the end, maybe 50 yards away. They were going to make it. They were going to. A second raptor emerged from a side corridor ahead of them, cutting off their path to the stairs. This one was larger than the first, with darker coloring and a scar across its snout. It fixed its eyes on them and let out that same hissing chirp, but this one sounded almost like a call. Elena realized with horror that it was communicating with the other raptor. They were coordinating. The technician grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her into a side room, this one a laboratory of some kind. He slammed the door and locked it, and both of them stood there, breathing hard, looking around for any other exit. There were none. They were trapped. Oh God, the technician was saying, his voice rising toward panic. They're going to get in here. They're going to kill us. Elena forced herself to think. The room was filled with lab equipment, computers, storage cabinets. And there, in the corner, was a ventilation grate. It was small, maybe 2 feet square, but it was something. Elena ran to it and started pulling at the screws with her fingers. They wouldn't budge. "Help me," she shouted at the technician. He stumbled over, still in shock, and together they looked for something to use as a tool. Elena found a letter opener on one of the desks and used it to work the screws loose. It took precious seconds during which they could hear the raptors outside the door, could hear them scratching and testing the lock. Finally, The last screw came free and the grate fell away. Elena looked into the vent. It was dark and narrow, but it led somewhere, and anywhere was better than here. "Go," she told the technician. "Climb in." He didn't argue. He pulled himself up and into the vent, disappearing into the darkness. Elena followed, pulling herself up just as she heard the door behind her splinter. The raptors were coming through. She scrambled into the vent, her shoulders scraping against the metal sides, and pulled the grate back into place behind her, hoping it would slow them down even a little. The vent was claustrophobic and pitch black. Elena could hear the technician ahead of her breathing heavily, the sound of his body moving through the narrow space. Behind her, she heard the lab door finally give way, heard the raptors enter the room. She held her breath, frozen, as she heard them moving around below, heard their claws clicking on the floor. Then she heard one of them at the vent opening. She heard it, sniffing, heard it chirp softly. It knew they were in there. Elena's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The raptor pushed at the grate, and Elena heard the metal groan. The grate wasn't going to hold. "Move," Elena hissed at the technician ahead of her. "Move now." They crawled forward as fast as they could through the cramped space. The vent was a network, branching off in different directions, and Elena had no idea where any of them led. She just followed the technician, trusting that he knew the facility better than she did. Behind them, she heard the grate give way, heard something enter the vent. The raptors were following them. The vent took a sharp turn upward, almost vertical, and there were metal rungs welded to the inside like a ladder. The technician climbed desperately, and Elena followed, her muscles screaming with effort. She could hear the raptor in the vent behind her, could hear it struggling with the vertical section. The narrow space was to their advantage here. The raptor couldn't move as easily as they could. They reached another horizontal section and kept moving. Elena could see light ahead now, another grate. The technician reached it first and kicked at it hard. Once, twice, 3 times, and it flew off its hinges. He pulled himself through, and Elena followed, tumbling out of the vent and onto a cold concrete floor. They were in a different corridor, this one on sublevel 3 from the look of it. The alarm was still blaring, but the corridors here were better lit, and Elena could see signs pointing to emergency exits. The technician was already running, and Elena followed him. They ran past containment rooms, past labs, past a group of other staff members who were also fleeing toward the exits. They reached the emergency stairwell and burst through the door. Elena took the stairs 2 at a time, climbing up toward ground level, towards safety. She passed sublevel 2, sublevel 1, and finally crashed through the door at ground level. The main facility was in chaos. Staff members were evacuating. Alarms were sounding throughout the building, and emergency vehicles were already pulling up outside, their lights flashing in the darkness. Elena stumbled outside into the cold mountain air. She was covered in dust and sweat. Her clothes were torn, and she was pretty sure she had bruises forming on her shoulders from the vent. But she was alive. She had made it out. Security personnel and emergency responders were everywhere, trying to establish order, trying to account for all personnel. Elena saw Dr. Cole being escorted by security, his face pale and drawn. When he saw Elena, his eyes widened in surprise and something else. Fear, maybe, or resignation. He knew his secret was out. He knew everything was about to come crashing down. Elena pulled out her phone. It wasn't there. She remembered it had been knocked out of her hand back in the observation gallery, back when the guards had grabbed her. The evidence was still down there, somewhere in sublevel 4, maybe destroyed, maybe lost forever. But as she stood there, watching the chaos unfold, watching as armed response teams prepare to enter the facility to contain the escaped specimens, Elena realized it didn't matter. The secret was out. Emergency responders would document everything, would find the raptors, would see the containment areas. Biosin's illegal de-extinction program was finished. An EMT approached Elena, trying to check her for injuries, but she waved them off. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. Not really, because as she stood there in the cold mountain air, she realized something that made her blood run cold all over again. In the chaos of the evacuation, in the panic and the alarms, she had seen something. When she had been running through sublevel 3, passing the containment rooms, she had glanced through a window and seen something that didn't make sense at the time. One of the containment rooms had been open, empty, and it wasn't a room for small specimens. It was one of the large containment areas, the kind they use for bigger animals. How many specimens had Biosin created? How many were down there? And more importantly, how many had escaped during the breach? Elena looked back at the facility, at the mountain wilderness surrounding it, at the darkness beyond the lights of the emergency vehicles. Somewhere out there, in the forest, in the night, there might be something else. Something bigger, something more dangerous than the raptors they had just barely escaped. She pulled one of the emergency responders aside, a woman in a fire department uniform. "You need to sweep the entire facility," Elena said urgently. "Every level, every containment area, and you need to check the perimeter. There might be more specimens loose. Not just the raptors, bigger ones." The woman looked at Elena skeptically. "Ma'am, we're handling the situation. Please let us do our jobs." But Elena knew they didn't understand. They couldn't understand because they hadn't seen what she had seen down there. They hadn't seen the size of those containment areas, hadn't read the documents she had found, documents that mentioned multiple specimen types, multiple projects running in parallel. As the night wore on and the situation slowly came under control, Elena learned that the two raptors that had escaped were eventually contained and sedated. One had been found in the sublevel 3 corridors, the other in the ventilation system. No one had been killed, though several staff members, including Elena, had been injured. It was being called a miracle and near disaster averted. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When she had a chance, she grabbed one of the senior emergency responders and demanded to know if they had checked all the containment areas. He had assured her they had, that all specimens were accounted for. How many specimens? Elena had asked. 3 raptors, 2 passenger pigeons, and 1 Tasmanian tiger. The responder had read from clipboard. All accounted for, but Elena knew that was wrong. She had seen the manifest herself weeks ago when she had first started investigating. There had been more specimens than that. There had to be. She tried to explain this to the responder, but he dismissed her concerns, attributing them to stress and trauma from the incident. As dawn began to break over the Sierra Nevada mountains, Elena sat in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, watching as the last of the emergency personnel prepared to leave. The facility was being locked down, quarantined until a full investigation could be conducted. Biosin's leadership was being rounded up for questioning. It was over. But as Elena looked out at the forest surrounding the facility, at the miles and miles of wilderness that stretched in every direction, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over at all. That somewhere out there, something was moving through the trees. Something that had slipped away during the chaos. Something that was now free in the wilderness. She thought about the documents she had seen, the references to apex specimens and Phase 3 trials. She thought about the large containment area she had glimpsed, empty and open. And she thought about the tracks she had seen in the dirt near the loading dock weeks ago, tracks she had dismissed as equipment marks at the time, but now realized might have been something else entirely. The infiltrator had exposed the secret, but in doing so, had she unleashed something far worse? As the ambulance pulled away from the facility, taking Elena down the mountain toward the hospital in Fresno, she looked back one last time. The facility was quiet now, the alarms finally silenced, the emergency lights turned off. It looked peaceful, almost benign in the early morning light. But Elena knew the truth. The infiltration had succeeded. The evidence would come out. Biosin would face consequences. But the real question wasn't what had happened in the facility. The real question was what had escaped from it. And that question wouldn't be answered until it was too late. Elena checked her watch. It was 6:23 a.m. The entire ordeal, from the moment she had entered sublevel 4 to the moment she had escaped into the mountain air, had been less than 7 hours. 7 hours that had felt like a lifetime. 7 hours that had changed everything. As the ambulance descended the mountain road, Elena pulled out her phone. Not the one she had lost in the facility, but her backup that she kept in her car. She had calls to make, people to warn, authorities to contact. The story had to get out, all of it, before Biosyn could cover anything else up. But as she started to dial, she paused. Through the ambulance window, she could see the forest passing by, dark and vast and full of secrets. And she wondered if anyone would believe her when she told them what she suspected. That somewhere in those woods, something was learning to hunt. Something was adapting to a new world, millions of years after its kind had vanished from the earth. The infiltrator had gotten inside, but something else had gotten out. And that was the real horror story.